Students, econ students, this is video 2 of 3. So the first video talks a lot about costs, right? And so we now move into the last 4 chapters, which are the 4 chapters describing the different types of competition. And so pause this, right? Prior to this video, so in between video 1 and 2, please watch the Khan Academy types of competition video. And so that explains the 4 types and how they kind of all fit together on an X and Y axis relative to differentiation and number of players or competitors. Uh-oh, there's my golden retriever busting in on us. Okay, so chapter 14 is this video. We will talk about, if you are looking through the chapters, chapter 14 goes into our first item, which is competitive markets. And so in the text refers to competitive markets as something called perfectly competitive, right? And so when we talk about perfectly competitive, we are thinking about, the things that I'm concerned about you knowing for this chapter really are, what are the rules of that type of marketplace, right? What are the characteristics that make you a perfectly competitive marketplace, also known as the rules that you need to play by if you are working or operating in a perfectly competitive marketplace, and what makes something called a competitive marketplace or perfectly competitive. All right, so let's first look at the characteristics of a perfectly competitive marketplace, right? So you've already watched the video, and so you know that there is low differentiation, right? Products are similar. The text refers to them as identical, but similar is really what it is. Many buyers, many sellers, right? So giant marketplace, many buyers, many sellers. Goods are largely the same. And firms can come and go out of the marketplace pretty easily. It's not heavily branded. There isn't a barrier to entry. So, this is like our retail business. You can go and sell jeans for $30, right? You can sell flip-flops. You can sell items that, for the most part, are not highly differentiated. Somewhat. They're not exactly the same, but sneakers, you could come up with a sneaker brand and sell sneakers for $60, whatever it might be. So one of the main characteristics of this marketplace is something called the buyer and the seller are price takers. The price is kind of determined by the buying habits and selling habits and nobody really has, no single buyer, no single seller, right, can really sway the market. So you have lots of buyers, lots of sellers, and they're playing an even game. So most of the things that we have been, really all of the things that we have talked about up until this point, have been something that we would largely see in a perfectly competitive marketplace, right? The supply and demand, we have lots of sellers, lots of buyers, and the models that we have looked at, are tied to things that are mostly in a perfectly competitive marketplace. And so kind of go through some of these slides and start to think about total revenue and average revenue as it's attached to items for sale. And again, I'm not concerned that you know these formulas inside and out, but I am concerned that you think about profit maximization and how, when we look at marginal revenue being either greater than marginal costs, right? Or we look at marginal revenue being less than marginal costs, what we want to see is where they equal each other, because that means that it's dialed in perfect. There's not 1 penny more to be made, right? But we're also not leaving 1 penny on the table that could be made, right, but is not being made. So it comes down to that 1 penny. That's why we have the profit maximization, which sounds counterintuitive, is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? Because we're producing up until that point. We keep producing until they equal each other. And if we go too far, then that's not good either, right? Because now our marginal costs are above our marginal revenue, so we're losing money. But we want to keep operating until we get to that point where the two meet. That's profit maximization. So that is a tricky concept, but take a look at a few of the examples in, for instance, slide number 11, that talks about these different curves, right? And what the marginal cost curve is actually the firm's supply curve, right? The other topic in this chapter is something called a sunk cost. And this is a cost that maybe has already occurred. So oftentimes we'll refer to things that maybe we've already kind of paid for and we have is something that's a sunk cost. So it's like already been covered, right? And so then if we take something that is maybe already happened and we could turn it into something, then that's another way of recouping some of the sunk costs. And so this is with our looking at a competitive firm and plotting some of the items that we talked about in chapter 13. For instance, the average total cost curve, right? Again, when we look at some of these curves, they're really like a for instance, right? And they really represent what the average kind of curve would look like for these different topics: marginal cost, marginal revenue, right? And so thinking about a competitive firm, we can actually quantify the profit by interlacing or overlaying these different curves: the marginal cost, marginal revenue, and the average total cost curve. And that is in, let's see, what slide is that in for you? That is in slide 15. All right, so there are a couple other things in here about firms having different costs. Costs rise as firm enter the market, right? Because you have to remember that the supply is often limited of a key input. So that is number 2. And so then the nice conclusion for this one on slide 18 talks about profit maximization, what perfect competition is, how it's represented with price equaling marginal revenue. And so we love this competition situation. Like, this is the clean game, right? When companies are falling into a somewhat perfectly competitive marketplace. Now, the other items that we talk about, the next chapter is a monopoly, and there's a few items I want to talk about relative to a monopoly. However, the other 3 that we talk about, monopoly, monopolistically competitive, and oligopoly, those are called imperfect marketplaces, right? Or imperfect competition. So we have perfect competition, and then the other 3 that are considered imperfect competition. So these are really key areas that if you're thinking about your paper, right, or your project, you can talk about what type of marketplace. And if you Google it and you look into some different areas, you may find different responses depending on how the company's looked at, right? The company that you choose. What kind of products do they offer? You may want to choose a product specifically and talk about what kind of marketplace is it in. Is it heavily branded and differentiated from other products, which is something called a monopolistically competitive marketplace? Is it like Coke and Pepsi, and maybe in a oligopoly situation, or a special situation in an oligopoly marketplace called a duopoly, when there's 2 main players? And what are the rules to that game? So we'll cover that in later chapters. Okay, so that is chapter 14.